Hi, I'm Renny Hartman here again. I'm going to talk about two novels set in World War II. One by Elliot Roosevelt, who was the oldest son of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And another novel called The Stolen Lady, which is about saving the artwork in the Louvre from the invasion of the Germans. Elliot's book is really just set in 1943 and is a murder mystery. This book is about how they moved contents of the Louvre all over France, back and forth, up and down, basically concerned about saving the Mona Lisa. I really like this book. I didn't know that Elliot Gould wrote murder mysteries. It's a little book. You can read it in a couple days, mostly dialogue. I don't think the murders are real by any means, but he wants to feature his mother as the super detective. I've read a number of Margaret Truman novels, also set in Washington, D.C., and she includes a tremendous amount of description of the National Cathedral and the Capitol and the White House. But she's writing much larger, well-developed novels with many more fictional people. Almost everybody in this book actually are real people, except those that get killed and those that are responsible for the killing. So what I thought is interesting here, and I've started another one that's set in 1940, actually before we're in the war, is what went on in the White House, what Franklin Delano Roosevelt was thinking. In the 1940 book, he hasn't committed to running for his third term. In this novel, he is in his third term. However, he is not really well, and there's strong consideration about how he is a war leader. And it includes huge numbers of real historical people like Harry Hopkins and Dulles and the people that were in his cabinet and administration, the people that came every night at 6 o'clock to have cocktails. That was the cocktail hour for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He made his own martinis. He made strong martinis that made him famous. He looks like a very attractive man in the book. I can't say I personally admire him. I used to when I was a very young person, because the history you were given in high school or in college, he was a wonderful person. He saved us from the Great Depression. He saved us during World War II. I no longer really believe that. He prolonged the Great Depression with huge deficit spending that we are now suffering from horrendously, but didn't exist when he became president. The only thing that was deficit when he became president was a minor amount of World War I bonds. And he followed the idea that if we spent more, that would create a bigger economy. Actually, it creates inflation, which we are seeing today. He was even told by his secretary, Morgenthau, in 1938, we have spent all this money and we still have 20% unemployment. What are we going to do? Well, what happened that was good for the United States is we got into World War II. In this book, we're in 1943. So he has already met with Stalin. He has just met with Churchill just before this book begins. Churchill had been in Washington, D.C. He has met with de Gaulle. And now Madame Chiang Kai-shek comes to visit. She is the wife of the leader of the Chinese. We were allied with the Chinese at the time. And she came to get more support from the United States for China to confront the Japanese that were overrunning the Far East. The portrait of Madame Chiang Kai-shek isn't very positive, and I have no idea what she might have been like as an actual person. But the person who is murdered in this book is a spy who's carrying a coded message that probably wouldn't have really happened, seeming to indicate that we should be moving more of our troops and ships from the Pacific into the Indian Ocean, because the Japanese are going to make a big move against northern India, Tibet, and that area that China today is in Nepal and Tibet as it is. She's not too attractive, and FDR doesn't like her too much. Eleanor Roosevelt really wants to keep the murder quiet, and they do for a week, keep the murder out of the press. And we find all kinds of things about Chinatown in Washington, D.C., how the Chinese adapt in the United States, but keep their own culture, which is not necessarily the American culture at all, and how the people that have attended Madame Chiang Kai-shek have not always been the best people that she should have brought. And at that time in the White House, I am not sure they have the fence around the White House yet, because even when we entered into World War II with the attack on Pearl Harbor, if Eleanor Roosevelt was in the White House on any given day, she had tea at 4 o'clock, and you, as a tourist, could enter the White House and have tea with Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, eventually, they put the big fence up. They didn't put the bunkers up and the things that they have today, but they did put the fence up. And there were only certain areas that you could enter, the south door, the north door, the east door, and they kept records of who came and who left. But they didn't necessarily search anybody or want anything from anybody. If they were in and out of the White House and they were allowed in and out of the White House, nobody did anything much about them. And that is a key to solving the murder, that people could get in and out of the White House. They weren't supposedly not in the White House. And that's how they find out the person who was the murderer in the end, who should never have been able to get through the gates, actually came in, and nobody stopped him because he used another name. He used a fake name, and they let him through. But I enjoyed the book, and I've started another one, and there's about 20 of them. It's also interesting because Elliot, as the oldest son, really knew how the family worked and interacted. If we're in 43 in this current novel, he's overseas. He served. So did the Franklin Jr., and practically everybody at the time, senators, sons, congressmen, and their sons, also served. Unlike when you look at Vietnam, when everybody wanted to be away from whatever we were involved in. But in World War II, Washington, D.C. was very emphatic on how we fought the war and how we should be able to use allies, and what they were worth to us, and what it was worth to sacrifice people that were actually in the war. Madame Chiang Kai-shek talks about how her husband, called the Generalissimo, has so many troops that he can commit. But China at the time is not fully in civil war, but is very split between a warlord history and Mao Tse-tung, who's coming up with a communist revolution that's going to happen in 1948. So that China is not really as strong an ally for its size and its propaganda than it was at the time. Also, I found something that I like about FDR that I would ordinarily maybe not consider. He split his cabinet so half was Republican, half was Democrat. When he had his formal dinners, he would have half Republican and half Democrat as guests, regardless of who was the main person being entertained. We certainly do not have that kind of community or equality in Washington, D.C. today. In The Stolen Lady, our stolen lady is the Mona Lisa. And this book is a little bit bigger, takes a little bit more time, but covers World War II and starts with the invasion of northern France and the concern for removing all the materials in the Louvre, because the Germans were famous for raping artwork and anything that was valuable in their path. And so they do create everything up, And they first move it a little bit south in France because Paris has not been taken yet. When Paris is finally taken, they move a little bit further south. And their big project of protecting is the Mona Lisa. And the book moves back and forth between Da Vinci and his life and the creation of the Mona Lisa. You'll have one chapter set in the World War II setting and another chapter set in Florence, Italy, or you might be in Milan, Italy. It depended where Da Vinci was at the time. He's already an established author. He's already done the Last Supper, and he is not really concerned with what we would call mural art, portrait art. One of the things that he's very much involved in is creating war machines, catapults. Um, he he made a drawing of what we would call a helicopter today before anybody could ever conceive or create a helicopter. We have all kinds of papers of his that show his interest in this. He was jealous of Michelangelo, who was a little bit younger. In the book, Michelangelo creates the giant statue of David that is now in the Vatican. At that time, it started in Florence. And he moves around because there is a political problem in Florence and throughout Italy among the Medici family, where the Medici family was in ascendancy. Da Vinci is not in such trouble. If the Medici family are thrown out, then maybe he has to move to another city because he won't have patrons and he won't have income from somebody that is not a de Medici. And he comes to do the Mona Lisa in the book. We don't really know exactly in real life, but she is the wife of a cloth maker in Florence who was allied with the Medici. When he starts the portrait, they are not. She has had several children, and because of the medical situation at the time, she has lost a couple children, and that might make her smile somewhat sad. People don't know what that is, whether she really expresses a smile or she doesn't express a smile. I actually saw the Mona Lisa in 1967. At that time, it was kind of boxed off. But I don't believe that they timed us. Today, you only get so many seconds in front of it, and it's behind a whole in glassed protection. That didn't exist when I saw the Mona Lisa. Actually, on TV, I once saw a show that he not only had one Mona Lisa, but there were several, and sometimes in different shades. Something like Van Gogh did many sunflowers. There wasn't just one picture of the sunflowers. There were many pictures of the sunflowers. Where some of the other Mona Lisas are, I can't say at the moment. And exactly why that is the most important portrait or most important artistic expression is not always easy to explain. They had to move lots of art. They had to move Greek statuary. They had to move some huge pictures that were hard to deal with, and some material was so large it was not moved from the Louvre with the group that moved the Mona Lisa. Something that goes very well with this book is a movie called The Train, which talks about the last train out of Paris with what remained in the Louvre. It's a movie from the 60s in black and white and shows how the trainmen and the partisans in France, as the Germans really were withdrawing. They're withdrawing because we have already landed in Normandy. Turn the train by changing the station so that instead of going into Germany, it actually goes around a circle in France. In The Stolen Lady, the emphasis really is on a young woman who was not a real historical person, and all that she accomplished starting out as a secretary and ending up being a famous member of the partisans and helping to save the Mona Lisa. As in the Elliot book, for the most part, the historical people are exactly real, but the person who's murdered and the murderer are fictional people and not part of the FDR administration.